Um, it's interesting. You make a video and you expect to feel something after. And then for me, it felt relaxing, which is nice. Um, but I'll keep doing these videos, like reading through this chapter and kind of talking out some of the history, some of my personal feelings on a couple things. Not to say I'm right and everyone else is wrong, not to say any of that stuff, but I feel like so much disinformation that's out there. Least I could do. I study history. That's what my major was in. That's what my work is in, working in historical areas and national parks and stuff like that. And with all the visitations I've done to these places and heard these stories and learned them, why not just share them in a way that's debatably positive? Um, yeah. So after some time, back to page 6 of this book. Um, it's tough because you look back at the past. It's so dark and it's so raw that you can't imagine this stuff happening today, but it still is. Um, so right now I'm going to talk about the loss of the native culture in the context of African Americans, well, Africans as they were brought over here from slavery. Little Kufa. um, yeah, and when I do these videos, I'm trying to go shorter and just try and go through this book for as long as I can because it is emotionally traumatizing in the context of understanding that this is the history and this is what happened, but also as a person of color and as someone who identifies as black at the end of the day, because what are Latinos? Let's be honest. We are basically the mix of everything that was came to this country, and here we are, right? So, nonetheless, for those of you joining or new or just watching the first time, I'm basically reading through Black Americans by Alphonso Pinkney, and in 36 pages goes over the entire history of African Americans up until like the 1950s, 60s. Yeah, but now we're talking about the loss of native culture. The Africans who arrived in North America were a diverse people who represented many cultures. Contrary to popular belief, they were representative of a variety of highly advanced civilizations. Let that sink in. These are not just people picked out of the woods or the forest or any of that negative stereotypes you often see and hear in these criticisms. This is Africa, the cradle of civilization. Civilizations have started there for thousands of years. One of the best history ed classes I ever took back in college was actually African history, like of Africa, the continent, and going through the histories of the place from like BC eras, like the first civilizations, Egypt, going through colonizations, and up until what they became now to the current free sovereign nations that are in Africa. Highly recommend reading and learning that history because it's very unique. But understand that when the enslaved Africans were taken from there and brought to the Americas, they were not coming from just nothing. They were coming from civilizations. These slaves carried with them to North America a knowledge of the complex cultures they left behind. How much of this original culture was able to survive the brutality of antebellum slavery has been disputed by scholars. There is general agreement, however, that systematic attempts were made to strip these people of their culture. In the first place, slaves were widely scattered on plantations, small farms, and cities throughout the colonies, and later throughout the United States. Secondly, slaves arriving in North America were from a diversity of cultural backgrounds. They were putting people on plantations from a variety of cultures. They didn't focus on that. They just focused on the enslavement and the economics of it all, because that's why they were brought here. These cultures might have contained many common elements, but they contained even more distinctive characteristics. Furthermore, since young male slaves predominated in the earliest importations, it was virtually impossible for the slaves to recreate the cultures they knew. They brought the men, they did not bring the women at first. So for cultures to be strong, you need the entire community. From the get-go, they were disrupting that community. They took the men away from the women, away from the children. The children were growing up without fathers. The fathers were growing up without their mothers, or the sons were growing up without their fathers and mothers. Like, it was just the men they took. Fraser summarizes the impact of slavery on the slaves as follows. The African family system was destroyed, and the slaves was separated from his kinsmen and friends. Moreover, in the United States, there was little chance that he could reknit the ties of friendship and old associations. If by chance he encountered fellow slaves with whom he could communicate in his native tongue, he was separated from them. From the very beginning, he was forced to learn English in order to obey the commands of his white masters. Whatever memories he might have retained of his native land and native customs became meaningless in the New World. Understand that they were separated from their kinsmen, from their brothers, from their friends, from everything, from their entire continent when they were brought here. And if you were lucky enough to find somebody who you can understand, they went further to separate you from that. Partly from fear of rebellion, partly from fear of you communicating anything. They needed to dehumanize you and put you into this class system in which you obeyed the masters. For that was the economic purpose of bringing Africans to the Americas. It's heavy stuff, but understand that this all happened. It is not surprising, therefore, that much of the old world culture failed to survive. However, the circumstances under which slaves lived did not preclude their retaining some cultural characteristics. For example, Franklin sees African survivals in language, folk tales, music, social organization, and aesthetic endeavors. Other scholars maintain that many more survivals of African cultures were so pervasive that they have remained to the present day. I read this actually put out by the National Park Service. It's called like Africanisms, like these little nuances that were basically created from the African culture. When you think about the American culture, it's not just European, it's not just Native American, it's not just Latino, it's not just African, it's all of that combined. And all of that has a presence in our daily lives. When you look at the context of rock and roll, hairstyles, art, music, a lot of it stems from these early on eras. A lot of it's diluted because, in essence, they took these Africans and made them Americans, African Americans, and then from that created this entirely new culture. Clearly, some aspects of African culture survived in the antebellum South, but the adjustments which these new arrivals were required to make were such a magnitude that an essentially new way of life developed. Whatever had been a slave's occupation in Africa, he was usually forced to enter farming or domestic service in North America. So if you think about that, it still kind of happens today. Like, how many times do we hear about these immigrant stories of, oh, back in my country I was a doctor and now I'm a cab driver, or back in my country I was a teacher and now I work at retail. The same thing happens today. It's disheartening, but it's true. And we all understand that. Or hopefully understand that, or grow to understand that. Slaves, I read that already. Yeah, slaves were forbidden to practice their traditional religions and were required to practice the religion of their oppressors. Although they were denied formal instruction, they had to learn English. The foods they had eaten in Africa were unavailable in southern plantations. Family patterns which they had practiced, family patterns which they had practiced were not permitted. Given these circumstances and being denied participation in the culture of the South, it became necessary for the slaves somehow to survive in a world that was both hostile and strange. The struggle for survival forced them to create their own patterns of culture, which represented a mixture of elements brought from Africa and those created by their life experiences in the New World. In essence, they were forced to learn English without any teachers or formal education. They were forced to work in this new Americas, doing things that are familiar but not exactly, because the plants, the food, the crops are all new. Think about it. Tomatoes, corn, squash, These were never introduced to anything European, African, Asian. All these processes that they were forced to endure and work in were all new. The environments were new. If for those of you who have ever been to Africa or to other places in the U.S., climates are different, right? So you're being forced to work in the South. It's very different. The animals that you see, the everything. It's even if you're like, for me, I'm from New York City originally. A lot of you know this. Right now I'm living in New Mexico. It's a desert. The other day it was like 40 degrees. Today it's like 70. And then hasn't rained like probably once this entire like month. Vastly different from New York. Now imagine that continental shift abruptly. Not even to mention the hundreds or if not thousands who died on the voyage or were just kicked off. The ones who were buried at the bottom of the ocean, fed to sharks. Now the attitudes of white people towards slaves. That's always a fun one. Although the first Africans to arrive in North America were not treated differently from white indentured servants, as the institution of slavery developed, it became synonymous with Negro. The process was gradual, and some historians attribute it to economic forces, although others see race as a primary motivating factor. Regardless of whether the precipitating factor was economic or a function of racism, the attitudes which ultimately developed toward the slaves and behavioral component of these attitudes led to a system of human bondage without parallel in human history. Without parallel. There's nothing like American slavery. Not even in South America, not even in Europe, not in Africa, not in Asia, nowhere. Nowhere was like American slavery here in the United States. As Tannenbaum has noted, and let me see. Frank Tannenbaum and Stanley Elkins, they wrote The Slave and Citizen back in 1946, so that's where this note is coming from. Where is it? Slavery in North America differed from other systems of human slavery, especially that practiced in Latin America, in that the North American slaves were denied in law and in practice moral personalities. He writes, while the impact of the law did not and could not completely wipe out the fact that the Negro slave was human, it raised a sufficient barrier to make the humanity of Negro difficult to recognize and legally almost impossible to provide for. This legal definition carried its own moral consequences and made the ultimate redefinition of the Negro as a moral person most difficult. They legally made it that you were not human. Hence, rather than being reacted to as human beings possessing moral personalities, slaves in North America were considered simply beasts of the field. That's how they saw us, as beasts, as inferior. That's the reality of the perception against Africans, against people here in America with darker skin tones. And this stemmed from the beginning. Because remember, at first, it says it, and it's historically accurate. They were treated no different from indentured servants, equal to those who were coming here for servitude for the possession of land and freedom within a given amount of time. Something changed where they denied them that right and turned them into subhuman. Not all attitudes towards slaves were strongly negative. However, throughout most of the period of slavery, the blacks were considered uniquely situated for human slavery as a result of certain racial traits which made it impossible for them to adjust to the civilized world of the Anglo-Saxons. Hence, they were destined by God to serve Caucasians because blacks constituted an inferior race. This attitude became dominant and governed the behavior directed towards them. Racial inferiority thus became the justification for the institution of slavery in North America. I understand I have a lot of people on here, and friends who I hold very dear, who are religious, who believe in God and believe in all this other stuff, Buddhism or whatever. I respect your beliefs. I respect all of it. My issue personally with religion is that it was used as a justification for this, for slavery, for God, any issue you could think of. When they run out of arguments, they bring in God. And objectively, as an argument, I respect it for your personal beliefs, how you feel, but imposing that on others, I will never agree with. And that's what was happening historically for thousands of years, for hundreds of years here in America, and to a degree still today, when used against the justification of a lot of the crap we see in the media. Furthermore, the free Negroes were, like the slaves, responded to in similar fashion. Throughout the slave era, black people were accorded different treatment from whites, regardless of their degree of achievement. Their status was based on their ascribed, i.e., racial characteristics. It did not matter if you were smart. It did not matter if you were educated. It did not matter if you're a good Negro. It didn't matter if you're a bad Negro. It didn't matter if you're doing crime. It didn't matter if you're breaking property. It didn't matter if you're smoking weed. It didn't matter if you're a scholar, if you're educated. It doesn't matter. Your skin tone defined how you were treated. Whether you were free or enslaved, it did not matter. Based on your racial characteristics, that's how they treated you. That is America. During the antebellum period, slaves came into contact with a variety of white people, slaveholders and their families, overseers who were poor and landless whites, and religious leaders. Although slaveholders differed in their treatment of slaves, they were in general convinced of the innate inferiority of slaves. They were in general convinced of the inferiority of slaves and treated them accordingly. If the slaves disobeyed orders, they were to be whipped. According to Franklin, again, Franklin's one of the writers I keep citing, wrote a lot of books back like in the 50s and 40s and stuff like that. But some planters went so far as to specify the size and type of lash to be used and the number of lashes to be given for specific offenses. Almost none disclaimed whipping as an effective form of punishment, and the excessive use of the lash was one of the most flagrant abuses of the institution. I know we can all picture that famous picture of the slave showing his back with all those lash marks. Think about what caused that to happen. It could have been they tried to run away. It could have been they dropped a pail and broke it. It could have been they were late or didn't scoop up enough crops. It could have been just because it's Tuesday. Slaveholders maintained absolute control over their slaves. As a means of social control, punishment was felt to be most effective. Violation of the norms set by the slaveholder was met with a variety of forms of punishment. Stamp describes some of the more ingenious methods. A Maryland tobacco grower forced a hand to eat the worms he failed to pick off the tobacco leaves. A Mississippi